So in this segment, we'll talk about the beginnings of the regulatory process and understand what this is and how it impacts how we develop and design and develop software. So we're going to talk a lot more about the details of the regulatory process next week, but this week we'll just give you an introduction to this process. So a common misconception here of how the regulatory process for medical software works is as follows. You code your software however you like. At the end, you perform a validation study, you submit the results to the FDA, and you get approval. This is not how the process works, okay? We're going to cross that out. This is how the process actually works. You establish a quality process for creating software. So your organization has a set of rules, standard operating procedures. We now have a quality process in place. We design the software, and we document that design. We perform risk analysis to see what could go wrong and what changes need to happen to that design. We may optionally meet with the FDA to review the process ahead of time and to ask them questions. There's a process for doing that. We'll implement our software and document. We'll perform a pre-specified validation study. It's a study that we design at the beginning of the process, hopefully by the time we met with the FDA, if we choose to do that. We'll submit the entire process to the FDA, and this is where all these words document come in. All of those are documented. We'll get approval or more likely clearance. Those are terms we'll describe more next week. But even at that point, we have to have a system in place for post-market monitoring, figuring out, getting inputs from our customers if things are going wrong to maintain, to support our software. So as you can see, the process starts a lot earlier than coding the software. In fact, if you look at the steps in the slide before, you'll see that half the steps happen before you even start coding. And it doesn't even end with approval. You don't just release a piece of medical software in the wild. You have to monitor it. You have to perform maintenance. You have to receive inputs from your customers because it's performing a critical function. So your company has to stand behind its product for a specific period of time. So to give a more humorous, perhaps, example, if the FDA were a restaurant reviewer, it will not only taste the food. In fact, as you'll discover at the end, it might not even taste the food. But it would be interesting how the restaurant's organization and how it selects recipes, trains staff, manages cooking, tests for quality, how it performs risk management, how it ensures that customers stay healthy, that they don't serve bad ingredients or food that may cause health issues to the customers, a million other little things. And it will really rely on customer surveys to see if the food is good. It will not really taste your food in the same way that the FDA will not actually run your software. It will rely on documented results to do that. So the goal of this process, if I were to summarize it, is that you have to do the right thing the right way by following an explicit plan in an appropriate environment. And that is the summary of how this process works. Now, what is a medical device? So if our software falls under the purview of the FDA, it's a medical device. It will be classified as a medical device. So let's see what the rules of what medical devices are. And then in the next slide, we'll talk about what is not a medical device as a point of comparison. So I apologize for the details. It's sometimes worth seeing some of this language just so you understand what these documents look like. So we'll go through this definition slowly. It's an instrument apparatus, implement machine contrivance, implant in vitro reagent or other similar or related article, including a component part or accessory which is recognized in the official national formula. This has a list of things that qualifies devices, intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions or in the cure, medication, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals, and is intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animals, and it does not achieve the primary intended purposes through chemical action within or on the body of man or any other animals, and which is not dependent upon being metabolized for the achievement of its primary intended purposes. So that's a mouthful, but basically it's not a drug. It's something that's meant to be used for the diagnosis, cure, medication, treatment, or prevention of disease in man and animal, and it works external to the body. It doesn't get metabolized. That is what a definition of a medical device is. And when we talk about software, our software comes to the regulatory process as a medical device. And in fact, all of the rules we have for software are simply slight modification of rules that we have for things like surgical tools or other hardware devices. So it's not a drug, basically, so it's a device. So if your software meets the definition of a medical device, before you can take it to market, you are responsible for meeting certain regular requirements, which may involve a review process or at the very least just registering with the appropriate regulatory agency. Not every piece of software, and regulatory review, as I mentioned before, is required if the software qualifies as a medical device. Now, not every piece of software you will meet in the healthcare sector is in fact a medical device. Some software does not need to be is not regulated that way. So here's a list from the FDA. Software that gets used for administrative support of a healthcare facility. The accounting software they use in the hospital is not a medical device. The FDA doesn't regulate that. Software for maintaining or encouraging a healthy lifestyle. All the apps that you see in the App Store for wellness, those are not medical devices right now. Things that serve as databases, generic software for electronic patient records. This is a critical piece of software in a hospital, but it's outside the FDA's purview here. It's not a medical device. Software that does basic processing tasks, transferring, storing, converting, and displaying data. And finally, software that's very peripherally used for medical purposes, for limited clinical decision support. All of those are not medical devices. So you look at that list, and if what you're trying to do does not qualify as a medical device, you say, fine, I don't care about the rest of this class. I'm going home. I'm going to implement things the way I want. And I would caution you here, there are two things that we have to be careful about. One is, what is now not a medical device may actually become a medical device. For example, take the wellness apps. If those end up becoming a source of problem, that people have health problems for using wellness apps, all of a sudden those may become regulated. They may actually come under the umbrella. And you want to follow the proper process, because if the status quo changes, you may find yourself in a regulated environment very quickly. The second reason is that the suggestions, the guidelines, the rules of the regulated process for medical software development actually represent some of the best practices for doing software, and this is the right way to do it. Your software that serves as electronic patient records may not be regulated the same way, but if something goes wrong, it could cause serious harms to people, and you may be liable. So following a proper process is the best way to both do things the right way, and if something goes wrong, to have a defense that said, well, we did things the right way, and if there's something went wrong, it may be the fault of somebody else. So it's both a self-defense and the engineering responsible way to do things the right way. So we have a video clip here that discusses what is not a medical device from Mr. Michael Nilo from the company Nilo Medical Consulting.
And this is a lot of current on the App Store. You figure, a lot of your fitness trackers and things like that fall under, or sleep trackers fall under general wellness. And there's a guidance that's related to that and provides a lot of good examples of functions that are general wellness and not regulated by the FDA. They're going to say, while they might seem like health-related applications, the FDA is kind of going, you know what, this is not a treatment or mitigation or something for a disease or condition. We're going to step back and say this is just promoting good health for the users. That line, like you mentioned, has been fuzzy and sometimes gets clearer and then sometimes gets fuzzier again as software becomes more sophisticated. And the FDA will always, and regulation in general, not just medical devices, but think EPA and everything like that, will always be a little bit behind the cutting edge. They can't make laws about something that hasn't come out yet. So I think you should be prepared for that. And as a digital health company, you need to have someone who is going to be monitoring those changes, at least on an occasional basis, so that you don't, something that was true in 2020 might not be true in 2024. And you don't want to have your company be in trouble because of that shift.
The same type of rationale is used in the European Union to decide what a medical device is. This is from one of the guidance documents, and this is flowchart. We'll zoom in here and just look at steps 3 and 4. So in step 3, we asked, is a software performing an action on data different from storage, archival communication, or simple search? So if it's doing this thing, says it's not a medical device, if it's doing something different, then we move on, and we go to step 4 that says, is the action for the benefit of individual patients? So if this is yes, now we may be meeting the definition of a medical device. So something that does simple storage or is for public health is not a medical device. It's just software used in the healthcare system. If it's doing something that affects the patient, an individual patient, and their health directly, it may meet the definition of a medical device and may be regulated in that way. So we've used these words, regulations and things like that. So let's get a little bit more formal. And let's talk about 3 words here: law, regulation, and guidance. And these are key words as we talk about the legal apparatus behind this field. So we have law. Law leads to regulation. Regulation leads to guidance. So what are these things? Law in the United States, for example, in the medical space, is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And this is a federal law enacted by Congress, signed by the president. This is what you have learned in Civics 101. This is how laws are passed in this country. Laws operate at a very high level. The expertise simply does not exist in legislative bodies to get into the details of medical devices, to give an example. So the authority to specify what the law means becomes a responsibility of the agencies, such as the FDA, which develops regulations based on this act and other applicable laws. And this sets out what the actual detailed law is in this case. Regulations have the force of law in the United States. Of course, they can be challenged in court like any other law, but regulations have the force of law. Regulations are also often at a high level. They don't get into super high detail, as we'll see next week. The regulation driving all medical software is 7 pages long. But the agencies then move on to create guidance documents. So guidance documents describe the agency's current thinking on a regulatory issue. So you'll see a guidance on cybersecurity. This is what we think best practices are. Guidance is not legally binding either on the public or on the agency, but in the same way that a professor tells you, take this seriously, you take it seriously because it just explains to you how they're thinking about a particular issue. So let's look at some examples of this. So regulation to guidance is the United States. The regulation governing medical software is the Quality System Regulation, Code of Federal Regulations 820. This is the cover of the PDF. And an example guidance is the General Principles of Software Validation. This is a guidance document. And we'll discuss both of these documents in some detail next week. The same process applies in the European Union. The regulation is the Medical Device Regulation 2017-745 that just came into effect in May of 2021. Here's an example guidance. It's a guidance from the European Union on cybersecurity in medical devices. In the introduction to the guidance, it makes the point about not being binding very clear. And it says that it cannot be regarded as reflecting the official position of the European Commission. Any views expressed in this document are not legally binding, and only the Court of Justice of the European Union can give binding interpretation of union law. So the guidance is not legally binding, but it does reflect the agency's current thinking on the issue, and as such, is pointing you to the right direction a little bit. So we'll end this lecture by giving you some list of documents that we'll use as a basis for the remainders of this class. The first is a list of key regulatory documents. These are the original regulations. This is the US regulation, the Quality System Regulation of 1995. This is the Medical Device Regulation of the European Union. This is the 2017-745 that just came into effect. We have the guidance from the FDA, the old guidance, the General Principles of Software Validation. We'll discuss in some detail next week. We'll have documents from the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. This last one says FDA, but it's really a reissue of an IMDRF document. And this is all on this new area of software as a medical device. And we'll talk a little bit about that next week and then throughout the rest of the week. And then the final two are documents that pertain to artificial intelligence, machine learning, the draft guidance from the FDA, and a very interesting document from Singapore, actually, that talks about the entire process, but we'll zoom in on the aspect of it that talks about artificial intelligence and machine learning. And this will come in week 11 of this class. In addition to regulatory documents, we have international standards. And to define the international standard from the ISO, International Standard Organization of the main bodies, a standard is a formula that describes the best way of doing something. Standards are the distilled wisdom of people with expertise in the subject matter and who know the needs of their organizations represent. People such as manufacturers, sellers, buyers, customers, trade associations, users, or regulators. So international standards are documents that are written by committees from various sources, from industry, government, and others, and they try to express the best way of doing something. So these are often known as soft law. Companies follow them and adhere to them. They are not really law that's passed by government, but they're what's called soft law. They represent best practices, and they show that your company is following the best way of doing something. And just to discuss this a little bit more, I have a clip from Mr. Alka Menon, she's a sociologist at Yale, who will talk about this topic to us.
When we think of regulations and hard law, that's the sort of power of the Food and Drug Administration or acts passed by the United States Congress. So they're legal instruments that have some sort of teeth to them, even if it's just that they can be, sued for enforcement in court and might have to pay a civil fine. So what ends up being really important for organizations that are engaged in really complex technical kinds of product development is soft law. Because hard law is something that is dependent on the jurisdiction in which the company or the organization is chartered. But soft law is designed to coordinate across these kinds of hard law jurisdictions. So it just escapes the question of jurisdiction and courts altogether and thinks at this higher level of what is the best way to do something. So you can think of it as best practices, of standards, of sort of guidelines of how, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time that you're going to show what good documentation is. So that's something that if you want to make a product or an organizational goal that extends across multiple national boundaries, you want to think about investing in a soft law component, compliance component.
So the most important standards in medical software are these four. ISO 13485, this is the quality management systems description for medical devices. ISO 14971, this is the application of risk management to medical devices. These two are known as so-called management standards. IEC 62304, this is the system lifecycle processes. This is going to be our guide for much of this course. And finally, IEC 62366, this is usability engineering, how we design software to avoid user errors and keep them safe. And again, these are what Professor Menon said are called soft law. They do not have the force of law, but the regulatory agencies look at compliance with the standards, if you follow the procedures laid out in the standards, as evidence of good work. And these standards are recognized. And so you have a much easier time at many regulatory review processes. You say, well, our software process follows IC 62304. The agency knows exactly what you're doing, and they're very happy when you say something like that. The standards may not be 100% in fulfilling the needs for a particular jurisdiction. So ISO 13485, as we'll talk later, is not one-for-one the same as what the FDA would look for in a quality system, but it's close and it gets you most of the way there. So this ends this discussion, our introduction to regulatory process. In the next three segments, Professor Nicolai will come in and he'll talk to you about the healthcare system, the current state of the US healthcare system, why it's so expensive, and the opportunities for software to transform how we think about healthcare. Thank you.